Hello, everyone. I'm Sneha Raghavan from Asia Art Archive in India. And I'm delighted to welcome all of you to today's online public presentation by Shrujana N. Shridhar, who was the recipient in 2019 of the research grant initiated by the Sher-Gil Sundaram Arts Foundation in collaboration with Asia Art Archive for Histories of Ideas, Art Writing, and Visual Culture. The aim of this research grant has been to encourage the use of innovative methodologies for purposes of identifying, documenting, researching, and annotating periodicals and other print visual cultural materials that have hitherto been inaccessible in the public domain and are often fugitive, and to thereby open up research avenues into histories of wider discursive fields, specific regional milieux, and explore the politics of image making and circulation. Shrujana received this grant in 2019 for her project, Architects of a Literary Revolution, Unpacking the Connections and Aesthetic of the Dalit Panther and Little Magazine Movements. And for her presentation today, we'll be sharing some aspects of this research, where she explored how Dalit writers and leaders of the Dalit Panther movement made use of these unperiodicals and of the Little Magazine movement to experiment in previously unexplored ways with the intention of bringing to light the truth of their people. Following her presentation, Shrujana will be in discussion with Rahee Punyashloka. My thanks to both Shrujana and Rahee for being a part of this program today. Let me read out their bios. Shrujana N. Shridhar is an illustrator and artist based in Mumbai. Her work, which includes children's books and editorial illustrations, centers on anti-caste expression from an Ambedkarite and feminist perspective. She belongs to the Ambedkarite Buddhist community and runs the Dalit Panther archive, which focuses on digitizing and translating little magazines and literature published by members of the Dalit Panther movement. Rahee Punyashloka is a writer, artist, and filmmaker based out of Bhubaneswar and New Delhi. He creates anti-caste art and discourse under the moniker Artatekar. His work has been exhibited at Jakarta International Documentary and Experimental Film Festival, the Athens Video Art Festival, International Film Festival Rotterdam, Tribeca Film Festival, Ishara Art Foundation Dubai, the Method Gallery Mumbai, and MAP Bangalore, among others. The format for this evening is that Shrujana will make a presentation of about 45 minutes, following which she and Rahee will be in conversation. And then we will take audience questions. As this is a webinar format, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to post your questions. And you can start posting them, right through the session, and we'll take it up during the Q&A sessions. So without any further delay, over to you, Shrujana.
Hello, everyone. Jai Bhim, Jai Savitri. Thank you, Asia Art Archive and Sher-Gil Sundaram Foundation for having me and for also awarding this grant to me. It's been a long road to get here. The pandemic didn't help us in the middle of all of that. And I also really want to thank Rahee for being here and accepting my request to do this with me. I'll just start off with sharing my screen and we can get right to it. I would actually like to start just by giving you a small background. I'm from an intercaste family. My father is from an SC community and my mother is from a Bahujan community. My parents are both activists and have been involved in various social justice movements, and I was myself raised in the movement. And this is not very rare for a lot of Ambedkarite families. My father is also a Marathi poet, and while I was growing up, I would watch him translate many revolutionary writings from English to Marathi. And very soon it became something we did together while I was in school, we'd sit all night translating poems by Dasal, work on writings together. And I had learned about the Dalit Panthers before I learned about the Black Panthers. And my father showed me the importance of preserving and translating literary works. But as I pursued an education in art and design, I sort of lost touch with translation and writing. I just want to say before I move forward that I'm sorry for any like disturbance in my background or like if any dogs bark. Uh, so yeah. Um, anyway, moving forward. In 2016, I started working with some friends and Panther Sumit Jadhav on a non-fiction film about the Dalit Panthers. And usually in non-fiction films, to cut interviews, you have B-roll shots so that the visual is not just someone speaking at you constantly. And while looking for, and these B-roll shots can be posters, they can be old archival footages, or like any archival material or photographs. And we were in search of like posters, photos, writings, anything like that for these B-roll shots. And we realized that while we found some of those things, um, we realized that they were in very fragile conditions and they had to be digitized. And since the government was obviously not doing anything to preserve these, people had themselves very lovingly kept and very, as much as they could, kept it very safely for all these decades. And we decided that these treasures have to be digitized. And the idea of wanting to digitize them started there. Later in 2018, my father, Nayantara Bhatkal and Sean Satish, we landed up at the home of late writer and editor Satish Kalsekar. And a month before that, Nayantara and I had spent a lot of time at Mumbai Marathi Grantha Sangrahalaya looking for old copies of little magazines, making calls. And at Mumbai Marathi Grantha Sangrahalaya, they would tell us, oh, either that this is not there or that these little bits may be there, but you know, that portion is under renovation and we can't give you access to this, that. So there was like a lot of gatekeeping. And after like sort of like exhausting all our avenues, my father finally found out that Kalsikar sir had preserved a lot of the little magazines in his home. So we took a trip to his place in Pune, where he lived in a beautiful writer's colony. And he pulled out a dusty old suitcase from like the top of one of his cupboards. And he had many such suitcases. And inside it were filled with, and the suitcase was filled with so many different publications and editions from the little magazine movement. And we digitized all the material that was linked to the Dalit Panthers. And it was during this visit that we developed our mobile scanner. The mobile scanner was basically designed keeping a couple of things in mind. One, we didn't want to do a destructive digitization process. We wanted to do a preservative one. So we had to maintain and keep intact the spine and the pages and be as careful as we could with these documents. Secondly, we had to factor in the fact that we could be going to anyone's home and they may lose electricity or like anything of that sort can happen. So our lighting and everything had to be like battery operated. And so the way, I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but like we basically had a prayer stand on which we put a mount board. And so this is the mount board. And then on that, we would place the magazine like this. So, and light it from here and put the camera angle parallelly to this surface. So the image you get is like a straight head-on image. And after that, we would like we photographed every single page. Then I went home and like cleaned up every single image and put it together again as a book. So a lot of it were like, if the odd number pages were straight, the even number pages were like rotated. So I had to like digitally fix all of that and stitch it together as one PDF. So I think I may have done that for more than 30 magazines or like 20, 30 magazines. And like clean everything up and organize it all. And while I was in the process of like digitizing and cleaning and stuff like that, in one of Raja Dhale sir's publications, I found an ad for a magazine called Srujan, published by the revolutionary poet Varavara Rao. And as it turns out, this was the very magazine that my father had named me after. And it just felt like everything had come a full circle for me. And I still like, this is that ad. I still remember like my father's face, the expression on his face when he was so shocked to see a little magazine, while we were at Satish Kalsekar's house. I never imagined that my father, who had written and spoken so much about the little magazine movement, about the Dalit Panther movement, had actually never had the opportunity to hold a little magazine in his hand. And post 70s, whenever people talk about any of the Panthers, they always mention little magazines and their literary works. But very few can say that they've actually had an opportunity to read one or experience one. And it is unfortunate that due to lack of resources in our community, we were denied access, like, the opportunity to preserve these in the best way. And while I was at art school, I had to watch as my upper caste and privileged peers would, brag about about making like these fancy zines that were inspired by these European punk movements. And to me, that was really alien. So I could never connect to it. And I never felt like I could make one of those things. And all the while, for decades, there were these avant-garde publications published right here in Maharashtra by people, by leaders from my community that I didn't even know about. And that like 2 generations after have just been like denied access to. So and they were right here creating a foundation for like a cultural revolution in writing and publishing. So but fortunately, before the pandemic hit, I was done digitizing all the pieces that I wanted to digitize in that period. And I also, in one of my visits to J.V. Pawar's home, he casually mentioned that he had saved all editions of Raja Dhale's literary daily Chakravarti. And Chakravarti I had managed to collect maybe 3 editions from Satish Kalsekar, but he had all of the editions and he had very lovingly hardbound all of them. And J.V. Pawar is in the habit of preserving everyone's writings and magazines and his own diaries. He keeps it very carefully and meticulously. And with a lot of trust, usually I never have taken anyone's material home with me. Only he trusted me to say that, you can take this home and digitize it. And he had protected these editions with a lot of love by hard binding all of them together. And while I was in the process of now, after digitizing everything, my process was now to start translating everything we have so we can make sense of the things we've digitized. And it was very difficult to translate these works because and I had deliberately created a roster of translators who were women from SC communities from Maharashtra, so they could understand the context and references well. And I also undertook like translating some of the pieces, but it was a very difficult task for everyone and it took up a lot of time. And even then, a lot of the translations had to be reworked and edited later by me and Yashaswini Srinivas, a researcher who I commissioned to help me in copy editing. And there were some writings that were too difficult for us to correct or translate as well. And for that, I had to once again go back to my father and sort of sit with him and decode certain poems because there were references to certain brands or products that were very specific to that time and that location in this particular city. So there were many references, made up words, language that required a lot, which wasn't easy to like understand for us, let alone translate. So we managed to sit and like a puzzle, solve and decode all of that. And I took some of those translations and I laid it out into like the the English. I took it and I laid it out into the original designs, just so that anyone who is not a Marathi reader can have access to experiencing this literature in English in its original design. So moving on to my next section, which is a prequel to the Dalit Panther movement. The Dalit Panther movement was a political and literary movement. All founders and members of the movement were strong literary figures in themselves, and they were determined to challenge Marathi literary fiefdom through their realist writings. One of the milestone events that would impact the future course of the Dalit Panthers was Raja Dhale's provocative essay, Kara Swatantra Divas, or Black Independence Day. This is a translated version of it. For Sadhana magazine on 15th August 1972. The essay was written in the wake of sexual harassment of a Buddhist woman in Parbhani district. Dhale found what was more appalling than the Brahmangao incident itself was the punitive action taken against the accused, and he drew attention to the fact that punishment for disrespecting a Buddhist woman, for disrespecting the national flag, is much more harsh than disrespecting a Buddhist woman. And J.V. Pawar, in his book, Dalit Panthers, An Authoritative History, says that the Pune Municipal Corporation passed a resolution condemning Sadhana for printing the article on 29th August 1972. And the resolution was to prosecute Raja Dhale, Yadunath Thatte, and Dr. Anil Outsat, the executive editor of Sadhana, prompting Yadunath Thatte to resign. Dr. Anil Outsat is also, I think, the only person who has photographed, if I'm not mistaken, the Wali riots that happened. So when the cadres of the two parties marched to the publication's office, they were countered by the newly formed Panthers who had arrived in Pune to confront them. And according to Pawar, the Panthers managed to chase away the protesters and save the printing press. Although Dhale ended up with a criminal case filed against him by the Pune City Police. This is an illustration I made depicting that episode. Another important milestone was when Raja Dhale used his own little magazines as a platform to launch an attack on Durgabai Bhagwat for her views on sex work. He targeted her and other publications like Satyakatha. The episode began to be projected as a face-off between a well-established Marathi writer and a writer from the little magazine movement. And things sort of escalated with the burning of Satyakatha magazine by little magazine writers. And he wrote a scathing essay. Raja Dhale wrote an essay about the magazine titled Satyakathechi Satyakatha, which means the true story of Satyakatha, in his own little magazine, Yeru. And he continued to publish criticisms of Satyakatha in his magazines. In Chakravarti magazine's first edition, the criticism was written as a special report from Mumbai on 20th February 1969. This is that report. Dhale notes that when they went to sell an issue of Yeru magazine to Dilip Chittre, a Marathi poet and translator, they mentioned that an established Marathi newspaper, Navshakti, refused to carry the advertisement inviting people to the burning of Satyakatha magazine. And Chittre responded to them saying that there's a huge pipeline in Bombay between Bandra and Mahim suburbs. So he said that that pipeline is used for election advertisements and you can use that for your advertisement. And then he said that you can write on urinals at Churchgate Station with pencils that the burning of Satyakatha has been organized at this time and at this place. And all the Satyakatha fans, instead of pissing here, come urinate there and douse the fire and just wait and watch how it will spark controversy. And if no one comes, then you can write that, look, no one even wants to piss on Satyakatha. So this graphic and irreverent idea, which came from Chittre, shows that the young writers of the little magazine movement had every intention of completely destroying magazines or publications that symbolize the old and traditional established face of the Marathi literary world. Raja Dhale found his entry into the writing world as a calligrapher. He apprenticed at the age of 14 by hand lettering Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's writings. The founder of Marathi Dalit Sangh, Apparan Pise and T.P. Arsul, had heard about Dhale's talents and abilities as a skillful calligrapher and artist. And Satish Kalsekar, who was a very prominent figure in the Little Magazine movement, and a frequent collaborator of Dhale's, he considered Dhale's Aso magazine, which was published in the early 60s, to be the starting point of the Little Magazine movement. And he marks the end point at Chakravarti, which is a one-of-a-kind daily on all things literature and writing, produced by him and Dhale. And Chakravarti saw 8 editions and they ran for 12 straight days. Every day they published one magazine, one edition. So Chakravarti was Dhale's ode to the Little Magazine movement. And the 4-paged magazine was printed in 2 color. And this is the cover of one of the magazines. And it would feature either like an excerpt from a text that inspired him from anywhere in the world, or he had columns like get egg on your face here. In Marathi, it was written as Ithit Hobart Rangoon Vel. And these columns were Dhale's basically playground to name and shame anyone in the literary world he saw fit. And no one was spared. The style and design of this magazine would differ from issue to issue. And but one design element remained consistent, and that was this modernist chakra, minimalist modernist chakra placed on the cover. And it featured and it used negative and positive space to create this chakra. And what he did, and this was, and Dhale, a lot of people would always say is, very angry and writes in a very aggressive way. But what nobody ever understood about his writings, even if he criticized anyone else from the Little Magazine movement, he loved publishing, he loved writing, he loved expressing. And to him, Little Magazine movement was extremely important. And this daily Chakravarti was an ode to that. So in that, he named every single one of the publishers and editors of various Little Magazine movement from the movement and put them all here on every single cover of Chakravarti, irrespective of whether or not they contributed to that particular issue. So he made sure that he paid homage and paid the due credit and respect to the people from his to his literary peers. Dhale also published and edited Atta magazine, and which was an accordion fold little magazine, and this was a design solution that he had employed to save money. Among other little magazines was Tapsi by Dhale, Yeru, Jatak. Jatak is over here. Samadrushti, and besides this, his stories were also published in little magazines like Fakta, Timber, and Samagra. This is a copy. This is a cover of Timber magazine. Timber means dot in Marathi. So moving on to the other Panther leaders, J.V. Pawar and Namdev Dhasal grew up in the same neighborhood of Siddharth Nagar in Thaikla, near Mumbai's red light area. And Pawar says that he was Dhasal's first reader. And when J.V. first read Dhasal's poetry, he realized that it followed none of the rules of literature, and it made him see that rules of literature were based on written works and not the other way around. And these kinds of realizations are what led Marathi Dalit writers to use this new unique moment to set a new tradition and aesthetic. J.V. Pawar belonged to a working class Buddhist family. He studied at night school to complete his secondary school while working jobs during the day. And in 1971, Pawar's poetry was published for the first time in Asmita Darsh magazine's Diwali edition. And following this, he pitched his poetry to Satyakatha magazine. which at that time was an established Marathi magazine. So, and what followed after him pitching pitching his poetry to Satyakatha was a very harrowing experience. The editor of Satyakatha back then was Ram Patwardhan, and the editor called J.V. Pawar to his office. He thought that Patwardhan wanted to discuss publishing his poem. Instead, Patwardhan sat him down, criticized Pawar's work, and humiliated him. J.V. Pawar sat there patiently listening to Patwardhan talking about how his work lacked depth, how it lacked width, height. And after an hour of listening to him, an angry Pawar asked why he was going on about the parimiti of his work. And he decided to throw around some big words at Patwardhan and realized that him articulating himself very well irritated Patwardhan more than anything else. And after this incident, Patwardhan decided never to approach Satyakatha magazine again. And soon after this incident, Vasant Abaji Dahake, a playwright and artist, published an article on Dalit literature for the very same Satyakatha. Not only did the magazine publish Dahake's article on Dalit literature, but also published J.V. Pawar's poem Footpath, which had been rejected just a few weeks earlier. So it was these kinds of duplicities that prompted Dalit writers and the Panthers to create their own magazines. They started Vidroha magazine, which ran 5 issues and published some prominent names in the Dalit literary circles. Since Pawar was the only one with a stable income, he funded the magazine. And Vidroha carried prose, it carried poetry by stalwarts of like Marathi literary world like Daya Pawar, Vijay Tendulkar, Umakant Randhir. And in the edition that I have, the magazine features an illustration of a face throwing up, people protesting on its cover. And this was made by a relative of Dhasal's who worked at Film Division Pune. And the edition also carried an ad for Dhasal's book of poetry, Gold Pitha. It carried an ad for Asmita Darsh and for Raja Dhale's first Gatha titled Dalit Literature and Literary Studies. It also featured Dhasal's experimental poem called For 15th August 1971. A scathing comment, which was a scathing comment on the farce that is the Indian democracy, and it questioned the concept of freedom and wanted to know what Mother India had done for her children. And besides being radical in its content, the poem played around with form as well. And it was written as a free verse that was breaking the conventional meter and rhyme that poetry usually follows. And it was inventing its own rhythm to eventually be able to question the word swatantra. Next, we have Comrade Ani Octopus, which means Comrade and the Octopus, which was a little magazine. Like this was just like a one special type of edition that was published by poet and Panther leader Avinash Mahatekar. And we digitized its first edition from Ramesh Shinde's collection, who is a well-known Mumbai-based bibliophile and collector of all Ambedkarite and anti-caste literature in Maharashtra. The magazine states that it was published by Sarvaitle Prakashan, it's written here, which means publications from the movement. The cover features an intriguing typography that plays with an illustration of a hand partly covering the word comrade, and the words Ani Octopus are tattooed on the hand. The issue features only Umakant Randhir, a poet and member of the Dalit Panther movement. Comrade Ani Octopus mocks Indian Marxists who didn't care to understand the culture of the Bahujan communities and eventually lost their pull. He describes the comrades as being lost and they're being pulled away by an octopus that has entangled them in its tentacles. The poem suggests that comrades are being controlled by a computer. Now we can move on to the visual language and aesthetics of the little magazine that we've digitized. So Raja Dhale's work was influenced by Japanese and Zen Buddhist culture. His little magazine Atta, which is an accordion fold that I had mentioned earlier. This is the accordion fold, and it features like typography inspired by the Japanese script. The first print edition of Dhale's first anthology, Samagra Lekhan, Volume 1, was designed with Japanese motifs again, with the title set in Devanagari lettering inspired by Japanese Tategaki writing system. And the book is a collection of all his literary work, most of which were published in the Little Magazine movement. Besides visual inspiration, he was also influenced by Japanese writings. Chakravarti's issue number 9 features on its cover an excerpt from Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, written by 13th century Rinzai monk Muju Dokyo. And this leads us to observe a pattern in Dhale's visual and literary work, where he is influenced by his connection to Buddhism. And I don't know to what extent Dhale engaged with Zen Buddhism or which area of Japanese literature specifically interested him, but to me, it can be seen as an attempt to relate the neo-Buddhist identity and Bahujan identity to a global one. And in his interview, he always asserted that he always said, I am not a Dalit. My identity is not of a Dalit. I'm not a slave. And slavery was imposed on my community. And it's not that we are slaves. And he chose to call himself a Buddhist. And in the first edition of Dhale's little magazine, Jatak, he wrote an article titled Dalit Literature and Culture. And this article sort of maps out what Dalit literature is and explores its aims and objectives. He tries to establish the meaning of Buddhist and Dalit literature. And the article states that people didn't stop suffering untouchability because they converted to Buddhism, but it meant that these people rejected Brahminical culture and didn't want to be integrated into a Brahminical religion or society. But it doesn't mean that those who didn't convert believe in untouchability. It just means that they wish to be integrated into a mainstream culture. And with this, Raja Dhale urged that those who haven't converted to Buddhism yet should understand that cultural integration in a Brahminical society is a paradox and cannot be achieved within the realms of a Brahminical culture. He uses this article to question Indian Marxists on their relationship with their caste and religion. He was amused by Marxists who could not see the irony of them privileging from practicing a Brahminical religion and even just being from a Brahminical religion. In Chakravarti's edition number 4, he had a column called 3 Slaps available here. In that section, Raja Dhale criticized a Marathi critic and writer Eknath Patil, who Raja Dhale himself had featured in his other little magazines. But here he points out that Patil, like most others, feels the need to compare the little magazine Fakta to a revolutionary political movement led by Daniel Cohn-Bendit, a French student leader in his issue of Nav Shakti on 15th February 1969. So he accuses Dhale accuses Patil of being Eurocentric and having the tendency of name-dropping European literary names to pass off intelligence and rushing to compare anything remotely interesting happening here to rebels and revolutionaries of Europe. And in conclusion, he urges Eknath Patil to take a vow to never write again and never write another review in his life again. This is that excerpt. So in Chakravarti's edition 8, he pens an interesting parody obituary section, which makes fun of Chandrakant Patil's. Chandrakant Patil would very commonly threatened to retire from Marathi literature. So here he's making fun of his usual threat, and which is over here, and the piece begs him to retire for good. And he declares Patil dead in a literary sense. And similarly, he declares Pulitzer Prize winner Norman Mailer dead for accepting the Pulitzer Prize award and for being a useless writer who, according to Dhale, did nothing but grace the cover of Esquire magazine and chase after women. He makes a similar point. One second. Yeah. He was also writing on the growing influence of the Little Magazine movement. And in his article titled, "It is Foolish to Utilize Periodicals for Acquiring Fame," which is published in Samagra magazine. This is the cover of Samagra magazine from that edition. This is the excerpt from that particular article, and this is a translation. He says that when the Little Magazine movement started with writer Ashok Shahane, there was a lot of skepticism surrounding it. But when the movement started gaining steam, many started publishing little magazines to gain fame without sharing any of the ideologies. And he labeled those people foolish because they thought they can achieve fame through little magazines. And he called out such intentions, and he stated that these unperiodicals weren't a stepping stone towards fame, but are a step towards understanding the nuances of literature. And it showed how seriously he took these magazines and these publications. Raja Dhale had a master's degree in aesthetics and studied language closely. In his daily Chakravarti, issue number 8, he muses over the descriptive nature of language and writing. He writes that images can be seen, which means that what we see is true to what is being expressed. And Dhale illustrates this point by giving an example of an image. In this case of a girl, she can be seen as she is. But if she is written about or if she is described, it won't be possible to see her exactly the way that she appears. He makes a very similar case for sound and writing. And he considers writing as a medium to be descriptive, but writers aren't obliged to write descriptively. It can be used to reflect your thoughts and feelings as is, but language used so far has rarely carried beyond being descriptive. And that is why writers must experiment with writing to express exactly what they feel to the reader. And while Dhale was very driven and deliberate about making sure that his writings spoke to Dalit and Buddhist communities, he was equally passionate about literary forms and expressions. And one can imagine that for someone who saw the work they were doing as dire and urgent for their people, the obsession to express in the most effective way must have been a non-negotiable. And his writing shows that he was intentional and he did not lose focus from his ultimate goal of helping his community achieve liberation. A good example of writing that broke all rules to ensure that ideas be expressed clearly can be seen in Namdev Dhasal's poem for 15th August 1971 in Vidroha magazine. This is the poem. It's called Satyamev Jayate, and you can read that poem here. This is the translation. In the poem, he pens a descriptive note of the Indian national emblem. It starts off, and while you're reading it, it feels like a copy from a school textbook that we have also studied about the Indian national emblem. And as one reads this very boring descriptive text, it is interrupted by a loud onomatopoeic thun, 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 thun sound. And you can see that basically it's emulating a school bell. And the poem goes on to reveal that the heavy description that was being read out was in a classroom, and where values of democracies were being mindlessly taught and rote learned. And by the time you finish, like you reach this part, the school bell goes off and the kids are off, off to home. So, yeah. Mm. This is Fakta magazine. For Satish Kalsekar to study, according to him, to study the little magazine movement, one must start with understanding the content, because a lot of people get very amused and taken in by the shape and the size and the different kinds of publishing, avant-garde publishing styles. And but for him, the shape and form was secondary and the content was the most important thing. The important fact was that these writings express solidarity with working class, and to him that bias was very important. And because of that, it also prompted them to do readings, poetry readings in cremation grounds and ST buses, essentially various kinds of public spaces that weren't meant for poetry reading. And they would do it even in trains or at Gandu Bagicha, which is a park in Mumbai's red light area, Kamatipura, that earned its name for being a cruising spot for queer men. And the park has now been renamed to Durga Devi Udyan. And these were attempts by writers of the Little Magazine movement to democratize poetry and literature, to try and free it from the colorless halls of literary meets and events. And he explains that the choice of punctuation they used was also very deliberate. So after English came in, a lot of upper caste or like mainstream publications in Marathi would start using English punctuations in their writings and publication, but that didn't make any sense to the vernacular reader who was not actually taught these punctuations. So the writing didn't make much sense. So they decided very deliberately to only use colons and danda, like a vertical line, for full stop. And this was a deliberate choice for them, which was an attempt to disrupt or question the established literary conventions and even the accepted norms of sentence construction. So Kalsikar believed that the English style of adding multiple punctuations was lapped up too happily, like all too happily, by Brahmins who wanted to make writing more complicated. And since most people back then didn't know what commas or full stops meant, the authors wanted to make sure that the writings and punctuations were simple. Most writers, editors, and publishers of the Little Magazine movement were anti-establishment, but it's not clear to what extent and what it meant. Most oppressor caste publishers and creators of these magazines claim to be anarchists, but they didn't subscribe to any specific political thought. And J.V. Pawar contended that these writers may have been anti-establishment in the beginning, but later, as they grew, they became part of that very establishment. And that is why Vidroha, the magazine that he worked on, had a very clear agenda, and it dealt with very clearly dealt with social issues like caste. It also featured Daya Pawar's essay, Blood. This is Samuha magazine. Okay, this is Samuha magazine, which was published mostly by oppressor caste editors, and this was the only, strangely enough, only magazine that I found with a woman writer in it, and it was Malika Amar Sheikh, who was published as Malika Namdev Dhasal in this book, and her poem On Your Birthday, for your 25th birthday, for Republic Day of India, was published in this magazine. And while this issue of Samuha features many writers from the Dalit community and and also a woman, it exposes an oppressor caste gaze in its editorial note. The publishers insist that their little magazine is different, and they want to make sure that the creative power between Dalits and workers should be understood, and they wanted literature to have a better understanding of the political role that it had to play. But when you look at, they had a list of subjects topics you could pitch articles or writings, poems on, and they've pitched 11 subjects. And while they wanted to make sure that they are holding up Dalit and workers' perspectives and experiences, the only subject that they are accepting like essays on when it comes to Dalit literature is problems in Dalit literature. And Dalit literature had not even become an established or any type of genre in itself. It was something that was still in its nascent stage, and they already wanted essays that were pointing out problems in it, but everywhere else, like development of Indian music, some question in the arts, these kinds of things, effects of Marxism and Marathi literary traditions, these kind of things were not called on for criticism.
Shrujana, sorry to interrupt. You have about 10 minutes.
Yeah. It's easy to see why oppressor caste writers of the Little Magazine movement found themselves so effortlessly integrated into the establishment. When one contrasts their words with what Dalit writers have said about Satya Katha, you can see why it was easy for them to integrate themselves. Vasant Abaji, when I spoke to Vasant Abaji Dhake, according to him, the opposition to Satyakatha magazine was a very short-lived, small thing. He says that the tension one senses between little magazines and Satyakatha was not actually that deep. But while I mentioned his article on Dalit literature that featured Pawar's poem, J.V. Pawar's poem Footpath, he barely even remembered that article. And I asked him if it was difficult for him to pitch an article on Dalit literature to Satyakatha. He replied saying it was no effort at all, and they had no qualms with a topic like Dalit literature. And if one goes back to thinking about the experience that J.V. Pawar went through while trying to have his poem published in Satyakatha, you understand that in a magazine like Satyakatha, and particularly an article about Dalit literature, was a privilege that they afforded only to a few people. In the next section, we're coming to women in the movement. The magazine that I mentioned earlier, Samuha, where Malika Amar Sheikh was published, this is her name here, published, Malika Namdev Dhasal. And one can see that it's not for no reason that writers of Little Magazine movement or Dalit Panther movement were called angry young men. While talking to me, Urmila Pawar didn't mince any words. She said that the Panthers' ideology was rooted in the concept of an eye for an eye. And maybe perhaps they thought that women weren't needed for that. And they never thought of women's involvement because the need didn't arise. This is according to her. And according to her, they couldn't grasp women's issues, even though they managed to grasp caste and religion and class. This is a very sweet photo of Urmila Pawar and Hira Bansode. And while Namdev Dhasal and Raja Dhale were all celebrated for their honesty, their raw words, realism, and fearlessness, Urmila Pawar was defamed for the same. The ultimate aim of caste system is to maintain endogamy and control women's bodies. So to have a Dalit woman write about the double oppression of caste and patriarchy seems to have been an intolerable practice for every prospect for every man. And according to, like, when I asked Satish Kalsekar how come there were no women in the movement, he said it never even occurred to us because it was not the need of the hour. The need of the hour was to trouble the establishment. Hira Bansode, a prominent Marathi poet from the Buddhist community, who has authored many critically acclaimed poems like Mahapurusha, Hippie, Gulam, Striya, etc., had to overcome many hurdles to be able to continue writing. Urmila Pawar and Bansode were founding members of Samvadhini Stri Sahitya Manch. This organization would organize women from the Buddhist community in Bombay, in Maharashtra, to write and express their conditions and experiences in their own words. And their first ever, like, they would take writing workshops as well. They would encourage these women to be on stage and read their poems and read their works. And their first ever literary program was in Mumbai at Dadar's Marathi Sahitya Sangh. And this event was inaugurated by none other than Eleanor Elliott. And Hiraban Sode, while talking to me, expressed so much pride in the fact that these events that they organized was on a large scale, and they made sure that they invited big names like Daya Pawar and Elliott to ensure that the new writers from the community felt like they were embarking on something big and had pride about the work that they had set out to do. This is a photograph from one of Samvadini's events. We'll move on to the production and logistical details of how these little magazines were published. Satish Kalsekar points out that the distribution was always a problem, and there was not enough money to post all the magazines. And sometimes they would just end up walking to customers, homes or offices, and selling their issues for 1 anna. And they put in whatever labor it took to make the movement and publication a success. And and according to him, there was no editorial process as such. For example, he knew Baburao Bagul, so he was able to just ask Baburao Bagul to write for him in his magazine. And Kalsekar remembers the process of buying and selecting papers, where Raja Dhale and he would visit Paper Gully at Bazar Gate in Mumbai to select the printing paper. And what usually happens is that they cut papers for mainstream publishing or printers in a certain size. So all the leftover papers, which were odd pieces, were picked up by these guys. And they would print on newsprint, postcards, scrap paper, inland letters. And all of this was, according to Satish Kalsekar, it was all Raja Dhale's brainchild. And the idea was to be cost effective as well as look different in order to get attention. And Dhale and Kalsekar would go to Alibag to print because it was cheaper there. And Kalsekar remembers these excursions to be a lot of fun. And regarding the process of working on Vidroha, J.V. Pawar says that he would fund the exercise since he was the only one with a job and stable income. And since printing was expensive for them also, they would also go to Alibag and do their printing. And 4-color printing was obviously too expensive, so they stuck to 2-color. And in terms of distributing the magazine, Pawar mentioned that it was not an issue for him for them to have these magazines distributed, because they would print very few copies, like a maximum of 500 copies, because anything more than that would have been too expensive for them. And the little magazines would use each other as a platform to advertise with details about subscriptions. And there were ads for, like I mentioned before, Raja Dhale's first book on Dalit literary and literary science, and an ad for Namdev Dhasal's Golpitha in Vidroha magazines, Golpitha. And the method that they would usually use to publish was the cyclo-style method. Vasant Tabaji Dahake, who was an artist, is someone and a poet, is someone I spoke to, who worked on many different little magazines like Fakta and Chakravarti, and he didn't live in Mumbai. He would send his work to the publishers of Little Magazine Movement via India Post. And what had happened is, I spotted, the way I found out about Vasant Abaji Dahake is that in one of Chakravarti's editions, I found this illustration by him, and it was juxtaposed with this poetry. And for many days, I kept reading the poetry over and over again, and I kept looking at the image, and it would not make any sense to me. And finally, I was like, I have to find this man and ask him what it means. When I spoke to him to interview him, I asked him, and he said, oh, it has nothing to do with the poetry. It's just some random thing I made. And I was like, so is this how you would send your artworks? He's like, yeah, the publishers were never asking for the way that we do editorial illustrations today, where they send you an article and then you make an illustration based on that. They would just request an illustrator or an artist they like for an artwork, and you just send your artwork and they publish it in their magazine. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the text that is juxtaposed with. So yeah, and how he would just like simply post these artworks to them and they would publish it in the magazines. And he Vasant Abaji Dhake also recounted like many fond memories of walking around Dadar and Matunga, visiting many printers with Raja Dhale. Everyone always talks about how Raja Dhale was the best at sourcing papers, getting printing done, and in terms of publications. Um, Dhake recounts that Raja Dhale knew all the best places in Mumbai to get cheap paper, pre-cut paper, where to buy them. And once they would finish all these illustrations and designs, um, the publisher would, and once it was published, the publisher would either just post the magazine to the artist or poet who's been commissioned, or the Dhake would just pick it up on his next trip to Bombay, to save posting money. The Little Magazine movement and Dalit Panther's impact on contemporary Marathi publishing. Urmila Pawar marks these movements as a Renaissance moment, and she said that it took the fear of God and fate out of writers. She said that the way in which people wrote about God in the movement would have been unthinkable to Brahmins. The movement took on the holy cows of the establishment and promoted a sentiment of irreverence and fearlessness. The morality that was attached to writing was questioned constantly, and the grammar didn't matter. The strength to speak the truth is what counted. According to Kalsikar, when writers like Ashok Shahane from the Little Magazine movement joined the mainstream publishing world, it led to a few changes. For example, the Little Magazine movement had been using the Danda punctuation, a vertical line instead of a full stop in their publications, which became an acceptable trend among mainstream publishers. Books became more aesthetic, something that he thinks that the movement, Little Magazine movement, can take credit for. Moreover, when he's saying like, you got to look at these books and look at the publishing beyond material or form. And he says that the movement has a more important role to play in that. According to J.V. Pawar, the chief protagonist of Marathi stories and Marathi literature changed from it being oppressor caste, rich men, to working class and lower caste people from slums. Pawar noted that some changes were inevitable based on how society and time had progressed. He thought that some of these changes are natural to human evolution, but he did, however, maintain that Dalit literature has impacted Marathi literature significantly. So yeah, that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for patiently listening to me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shrujana. I mean, that was truly an incredible presentation. And perhaps I can request you to stop sharing screen. Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, the research itself is so expansive, and, I mean, and your observations are so incisive. I mean, not just about sort of the readings from the magazines themselves, but also from your conversations with, these writers, poets, and publishers associated with both these movements. So I think it's been absolutely great for us to sort of hear you take us through your research. I'll now invite Rahee to be in conversation with Shrujana. And we already have a few questions from the audience, so others can keep posting their questions and we'll take them right up after this conversation. So thank you so much to the audience for their patience. Over to you, Rahee and Shrujana.
Yeah, thanks for such a wonderful presentation, Shrujana. I guess the obvious sort of question which comes to one's mind is that, like the fact that this was a movement which was hinged upon the idea of the unperiodical, and the fact that, like there is no temporal continuity to how the little magazine is published. So that perhaps should have allowed the Panthers to, like have more sort of like, like not discontinue, not fade away, but rather, like be unperiodical in the characteristic fashion and continue publishing these little magazines over the time. But like we see, there is a very clear and rigid gap, and in that gap we pretty much lose all context, like before prior to your archival work. So yeah, so like why is it that like that sort of unperiodical structure did not allow for a more cohesive sort of like continuation of this tradition of little magazines?
I think it has a lot to do with, like, if I have to speak specifically about Dhale or like J.V. Pawar and Namdev Dhasal, J.V. Pawar and Namdev Dhasal just did very few little magazines as opposed to Raja Dhale. Raja Dhale was extremely prolific in his publishing, but I think it is a matter of also culture capital that Raja Dhale was doing all of this on his own cost. Nobody was supporting him doing this. He was extremely disillusioned by mainstream publishing. He never went, or I don't know if I can say he never went, but I know for a fact that he hasn't had his works published by mainstream publishers as much as other writers from the little magazine movement. And I think, like, for example, his anthology, Samagra Lekhan, is self-published by Gatha Books. So, which I think is still run by his daughter, Gatha Dhale. So the thing is that I really think that it is a matter of capital. It is a matter of it is the same old story of us just not of artists, writers from our communities just not having that sort of access, and and there's also maybe there's also disillusionment that sets in. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose like more than disillusionment, like it's the sense of exhaustion also, like because that's
Yeah.
something that we have as well,
That man
like we
wrote
yeah.
so much. He wrote so much, and people don't even understand the depth of his work, like, or just the sheer quantity of his work.
Yeah. I suppose like like that. I think like talking about Raja Dhale sort of deserves a little bit more attention, because like when you speak of him as this exceptional calligrapher, exceptional typographer, and the way he's manipulating around cost to create inventive structures and all, like like he just
Yeah.
sounds like a spectacular like conceptual artist of
He
his
did
time, right?
everything. Yeah, he did everything, right? He was doing all this while being a political leader, while being a militant political leader, while being an artist, while being a writer, and he's not just doing it for Dalit literature as such, or just for his people. He is also redefining the aesthetics of little
Yeah.
magazine movement, right? Like, according to Kalsikar, he plays that role of developing that entire aesthetic.
Yeah. So like I mean, could you just like say a little bit about like what happened to Dhale after this point, like after the sort of thing, like this movement faded out almost?
No, Dhale continued, like, he continued his political work. He
Okay.
continued, he ran elections, he won elections.
Oh, okay.
He continued to be a very prominent figure today. Like, when he passed away, I remember that people had so many different things to say. It's like, uh, you know, every person there are so many different perspectives because different people from the community have dealt with him in a different sense. Some people may have dealt with Dhale as them being cadres, or some people have dealt with him as them being his contributor with his magazines, or like, everyone has so many different experiences of him, and everyone experienced him as such a passionate person, as a person who was just obsessed.
Mm. Yeah.
And a lot of people mistook his passion for like anger or bitterness.
Right.
A lot of people mistook that, but he was just really very, very, I think he was a very emotional person. And maybe I could get one piece translated, which was published. There was a special edition of Asmita Darsh that was published some years ago, which was a Diwali edition dedicated to Raja Dhale. And all the writers of like his peers and people from the movement wrote essays on him. And each of those essays are so emotional and so beautifully written that, like, I really think that should be translated and put out for everyone to see what Dhale really was.
Yeah. I guess like
And
the
he was also
yeah.
the first to translate Langston Hughes and so many like African American poets into
Yeah.
Marathi,
Mhm. Yeah, wonderful. No, so like I feel like in a way the passion part, like by passion being seen as anger, that sort of still continues because like
Yeah.
when we present our art, when we present our like voices, like on the internet space, or like even in general, like there is this sort of interpretation of it as brash, arrogant anger, and like like
Yeah.
that sort of I suppose that's the only place we have left, right? Because like the way aesthetics in this country have been arranged, like it has been done by the upper caste, it has been done by like Brahmanical notions of like
Yeah.
how sentiments are operating, and like rasa theory, and like
Yeah.
complex aesthetics, like
Yeah.
like being this particular thing which should be acquired gradually, and so on and so forth. So I mean, I guess that's that sort of passionate anger, that sort of like shouting, as it were, like because there is nothing else for us but our voices, like that sort of becomes a logical remainder, right? In a
Yeah.
sense, because there is
Yeah.
nothing else that remains, right?
Yeah, and it also means that if we are expressing passionately, it means that we are articulating ourselves, and they do not want to hear a person who's supposed to be marginalized by them articulating themselves well, and so if you want to just mute them, you don't police them, and you
Mm.
just say that what you're saying is not valid because you come from so much anger.
Yeah. Yeah, like it's very interesting because I mean, when we see like globally see the question of people from the margins representing themselves and the discourse around it, it would seem that even though the previous generation, so to speak, like like was not able to fulfill its like demands in an absolute term, there were some kind of arrangements, there were some kind of like seepages into the mainstream, as it were, which led people to like assume that okay, this is an a priori, like like this is something that was being said by people 30 years ago, so like like, and they were indeed right, and so let's move from that, and like the subsequent generation of artists, subsequent generation of like politicians, activists, and all, like like build on that premise, they build further away from that premise. But like it's
Hmm.
really odd that for us it's pretty much the same exact problems that like these people suffered
Yeah.
like 50 years ago, and like like even now something as banal as suggesting that an anti-caste movement is the need of the hour, the fact that like we are continually like subjugated for our caste identities, it's as big a
Or just
question.
yeah,
Yeah, so
yeah,
that's yeah.
yeah, yeah, we are stuck in the same cycle and the same,
Mhm.
like, people, like, when usually, as a movement grows forward, you stand on the
Yeah,
shoulders of your ancestors, but
exactly.
that's just not happening for us.
Yeah, yeah, I guess
But
like in that, yeah, I guess in like that sense, I see like your project itself as a significant effort to address that question, because I, for example, am somebody like who wants to practice visual art by drawing from history, like like from by drawing from historical motifs, rather than like this idea that like it's going to come to me and I'm going to like create whatever I see around me, or whatever like is like organically this organic news situation happens. Rather than that, like there have to be like these visual motifs, these visual markers which I can draw from and draw through, right? And in that sense, I suppose like it was really wonderful when I like got to know of your project first. Like we didn't know each other like at that point of time, and like the fact that this sudden eruption of a possibility of an archive happens, like like which can let someone like me understand that like there were people before me who were
yeah,
creating art using a particular motive, creating like like even talking about the impossibility of language itself, like this is something that I suppose in the broader global sense is a very current thing, because like the whole post-structural idea of a language itself being arbitrary and so on and so forth, like that's something that is vital to discourse now. But the fact that people like Raja Dhale are like organically speaking about these things, and people like Dhasad are continuously like breaking down the language like in the most barbaric form possible, like that
yeah,
sort of
yeah, yeah,
like the fact
yeah,
that we did not really have that as a precursor, as a necessary precursor, which, like we just chance upon in our library occasionally, but like, like we had to make active efforts in our, like, in our adult life to even remotely get like glimpses of, like I suppose that would hopefully change with more and more projects like yours, right? And I suppose, yeah, like that's a step in the right direction, I guess. And
Honest, like me as an artist, I, aside from just archiving and finding all of this and translating all of this, has changed my life. As an artist, reading Dali has completely changed my life as an artist from the Buddhist community, because we always walk around, and which is what, like, I always say that Dhale always said, right, that you as artists and writers, you cannot walk around this world feeling like y'all are cultural orphans, because that's what we've been made to feel like. It's a matter of
right.
appropriation, it's a matter of being our art, our writing being stolen from us. But we end up feeling like we aren't creative, we don't have this because our ancestors haven't been doing this. But actually our ancestors have been doing this, and our cultural identity lies in the Buddhist identity and in that aesthetic. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible. I think Rahee's connection.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what should I do? Okay,
I think let's wait for a minute to see if he's back.
Yeah, hi, like sorry, like my Wi-Fi just went,
Yeah.
but like I'll just you guys can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was saying that aesthetic that we keep searching for, we keep looking for, even what you said that you want to draw from history, that comes from the Buddhist aesthetic, that comes from our caves, that comes from these carvings, that comes from these looms. So I think that really changed my perspective on myself as an artist. I was like, shit, it's not that, we don't have all these, like, our names don't come among all the great painters of this country, but it's our works that have built what makes India so diverse and culturally beautiful. It's our community's works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I suppose like there is also the question of like the fact that there are these unheard of and unappreciated like, cultural workers from the community who have like very diligently sort of preserved these artifacts, which I suppose like is affront to the Brahmanical idea of the archive being fundamentally something sacred, because like, and it's something that like it's something that, like, for example, like the Brahmanical like idea of archive is that like it's something that you learn by memory, right? Like you learn by rote, and then you don't like share it with the other, right? Like that's the sort of idea that I suppose that's the idea that the general treatment of the archive in this country is borrowing from in many ways, because in order to
I think we have lost Rahee.
Yeah.
Oh, there he is.
Yeah, he's back.
Yeah, sorry, this like happened at the worst time. Yeah, anyway, no, yeah. As I was saying, like the like the idea of the archive itself like almost is permeated through Brahmanical like notions, because in India I really don't think that, like, apart from a very few public libraries in major metropolitan cities, like there is no archive proper that one can access without certain, like, like credentials, right? Like, which is not very, I mean, like in other countries there are quote unquote like valuable material that one perhaps needs clearance to access, but like there are archives which one can go through, there are museums that one can like run through, right, freely. And I suppose like in that sense, the idea that there are these underappreciated like cultural workers, like who are diligently conserving things, even when it comes to Baba Sahib's photos, like these are incredibly important photographs, but then
Yeah,
they are being
yeah,
preserved by a single person, right? Like,
yeah,
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 so the precarity of the archive itself is so baffling. And yeah,
yeah.
perhaps you would have
Which
something
is
to,
what
yeah.
which is what I feel about Ramesh Shinde, right? From like
Mhm.
since the time that Baba Sahib was alive, since Ramesh Shinde was a young man, he has uh, like preserved every single Ambedkarite anti-caste publishing that came out of Maharashtra since then till now. Okay, his house is full of books and magazines and posters and bills that are just unimaginable. And he managed to protect as much as he could with the 26th July floods. He managed to protect it against all kinds of like things for the past decades. And I mean, I've heard that people are trying to digitize this collection, which is such an amazing, which is an initiative that had to be taken, that has to be done. And this man has just done it of his own volition. And today, any researcher who wants to like refer to any like writing or book or something, they have to turn up at this individual's home where his
Yeah.
family is there and go through things, and his family gets troubled, and and it's a Bombay house, so it's not big, like for everyone to be comfortable. You have to like, you really feel like you're invading someone's space while you're there. So yeah, these kind of individuals who have actually managed to preserve the culture and help in us being, as a newer generation, being able to define a culture, for the
Yeah.
future.
Yeah. How much of the like little magazine movement would you say is fundamentally lost because you couldn't find it, and like like nobody really has a copy, and like it's not methodical? So how much of it would you say is like would you estimate is fundamentally lost forever?
I can't even like, I mean, I haven't found like so many of Raja Thale's owns magazines, like his own magazines I can't find. Forget all of the little magazine movement. So it was so strange. Like the magazine Rava of, was it Rava? Yeah, of Rava magazine, where I have digitized the covers of Rava. One of Rava's issues, I have digitized the entire magazine. I was like trying to find out who's published this for such a long time. And then suddenly one day I found out that these people, people who started Rava magazine, live in the building next to mine in Chunabatti. And I was like, wow, like I didn't even know these people live in the next building, and I didn't even know that they're right there. And apparently they're going to do another new issue of Rava, like a reunion. So yeah,
Wow.
like I don't even know how much is lost. I feel like I myself have not gotten as in depth as I could.
Mhm. Right. No, like this is also this is also interesting because the way most institutions and like archives in this country are like created are because there are a bunch of influential people living next to each other who know who has like some photo with Mahatma Gandhi, some film of Jawaharlal Nehru, and like then like we will just collect them together. And so it's not even like the idea of archive, and this is something that any researcher worth their salt is going to tell you. Like when one goes through archives in this country, like they are very randomly assembled entities.
Yeah,
Like there is no method, as it were. Like there is nowhere close to what should be there, and like whatever is present is very arbitrary and like very sort of like like surface level assemblances, right? Assemblages. So yeah, so in that sense like it's not even that coherent. Like the archives that are presented to us within institutions are not even that coherent to begin with. So it only like like it sort of like makes it even worse for us, because हमारे लिए तो like even accessing that becomes impossible, right? So like to come together and like actually catalog these ideas, catalog like the entirety of a movement, catalog the entirety of the artifacts, like that sort of is always already impossible almost, right? So
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So I guess like a major question to ask would be, because you said like a lot about how much trouble you had to go through to successfully translate the works, and also like to sort of successfully translate the context from that era. I suppose like in that sense, it's a question of like why do you think that this gap constantly persists? Like like does it have to do with the whole archival gap question, or is it like that the language that was used and the like context that was used
It's the language and context used, right? Now, these are not people trying to write like mainstream, regular, like how regular writers and publishers were writing. They were deliberately trying to be experimental. So that in itself is difficult to interpret. Secondly, the writing, even if I'm from the same community or someone else is from the same community as, say, these writers, we're from today in this city, and this decade in this city looks so, and the references that come from right now are so different from before. So trying to interpret those, trying to interpret the names of certain brands of dalda, you might think that it's actually just a word they're using to describe something, but turns out it's name of some product that used to exist, or like a phrase or a slang, because a lot of slang was being used by them because they wanted to be realist writers, like Dhasal and all. They used a lot of slang. So a lot of it would make no sense because slangs are so very specific to that time, that community, that location and area, so it was very difficult. So in that sense, it was quite complicated to translate those works.
I have a feeling maybe
Yeah.
is Rahee there?
No, I think Rahee's internet is there.
Yeah. But yeah, I think this point that you were making, Shrujana, about sort of how writing, when it is sort of when there's a lot of rawness, or when there's the use of colloquial or slang, or when language is used very specifically and very deliberately, there is a way in which when the translation sort of happens, it sort of becomes like bad writing in some sense. Like it's if people don't really understand sort of the nuances, or the deliberateness of why it is used in that particular way, one thinks that one can it sort of there's a great loss that happens in the translation, and it's almost as if these are people who did not know how to write, and therefore the translation sort of goes in that direction, unless and that is why I think you're saying that it was important for you to find people who understood sort of the context, and so yeah, Rahee's back, so yeah.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Like this is like
No.
This is happening. Like
okay.
could have happened before. Anyway, yeah. So yeah, I guess like that question got answered. I suppose. Yeah. I guess like we'll take the discussion more like through the questions that have been already sent. Like I guess as a last question, I would ask you to speak a little bit more about the magazine that you were named after, which is Shrujan magazine, because that sounds like a very interesting fact from history, because it's also tying in Varavara Rao, who's not strictly from like he's from a very different context than the Dalit Panthers, right? Like, and that there were these cultural exchanges happening within these two movements, one in Telangana, one in then Andhra Pradesh, one in Maharashtra. Like, so maybe perhaps like a little bit about that magazine. Yeah.
So from what I know, the Srujan magazine was founded by Varavara Rao and his friends, who were part of a cultural group that was a Marxist-Leninist group. And the thing is that even if he comes from a separate context of like of the politics in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, the Dalit Panthers were working very closely with leftist writers. Even if Dhale was critical of communists, he was still like writing with and publishing with these kinds of with like progressive Marxist writers. So they may have had slight political, like, differences, or a lot of political differences, but I think that they still understood that, at some level they were working together, or they were, platforming each other. So I think, I think that's how there was still some sort of like solidarity between them. So and the Dalit Panthers, of course, one of the reasons of their split is because one half of the Panthers were more left leaning, like had more clearer alliances with the left than the other, and that was a point of criticism among them. So yeah, this is a very complicated history, but there was a lot of space for nuances, and they knew each other and they worked with each other. And yeah, about Srujan magazine, I don't know much, because I recently, someone sent me a photograph of the magazine. There's an issue of it in Columbia Library, but yeah, they have it. So maybe I'll find my entire little magazine collection there. So but yeah, what I know about that magazine is that it was founded by them for one literary cultural group of the Marxist-Leninist groups that were there. And a lot of people were named Shrujana in Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, after them. Yeah.
Wonderful. All right, like, I guess like we can take the questions.
Should we take some questions from the we have quite a few. A question that came actually a bit early on, which was about, for those of us from Ajanta, who writes, for those of us who don't know the Little Magazine movement, can you please briefly share what led to it? I think to some extent you have sort of in the course of your presentation, but if there's anything you'd like to add, maybe Shrujana.
I mean, just that the Little Magazine movement came from the period that it was, the 1960s, was a period of like revolution all over the world, globally. So the Panthers, the Little Magazine movement, they're all a part of that, So they were working off of each other's energy in that sense. So the same kind of discontentment towards establishment and being anti-establishment and being anarchist, whatever that meant, led them to creating these little magazines.
Yeah. We have a question from Rini Joseph, who says, hey, can you repeat the name of the poet? I do think Rini was talking about, the Indian national emblem. I think that was the moment when the question came.
That's Namdev Dasar. That's Namdev Dasar. That's Namdev Dasar's poem in Vidroha magazine. Then there's
Irina Glushkova, who asks two questions actually. Any idea how many little magazines or small magazines there were? And have you come across anything in regards to Janabai in the magazines that you have referred to, besides Raja Dhale's article in Asmita, which I am not able to pronounce, but which doesn't fall into the little magazine range, I suppose. Asmita,
So yeah, Asmita Darsh was not a little magazine. It was a mainstream magazine. And I don't know how many little magazines were there. No, I don't know about Janabai. But if you know, then I want to know.
We have a question from Aditya Sarin, who says, my question is about the editorial illustrations you had mentioned. Was the fact that illustrations didn't really have much to do with the text that they were placed against? Was it a function of the logistical difficulties in sharing text with illustrators? Like, was it a logistical problem, or was it a sort of, or did the movement also further embrace the disconnected nature of text image later?
So disconnected nature of text and image is not a feature of the little magazine. It just so happened that in some cases it had nothing to do with it. And also the idea of editorial illustrations and being an illustrator, these are all things that come from commercial practice. They were looking at each other as artists. I doubt Vasant, like Abaji Dhake, would ever call himself an illustrator. He called himself an artist. And they were just, it was not coming from a place of logistical difficulties, because he was able to send the painting or whatever artwork to him by post anyway. It came from a place of being like writing a magazine and thinking, hey, I really like, say, Rahee's work, and I want Rahee's work in my magazine, so I'm just going to put it in my magazine. It doesn't matter. Who cares if it has anything to do with the text? I like Rahee's work, it's going in my magazine.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. We have a question from Prakriti, who asks, was it Ram Patwardhan who had ridiculed J.V. Pawar's submission for the Chakrabarti magazine?
no, so Ram Patwardhan humiliated J.V. Pawar's submission for Satyakatha magazine. Chakravarti magazine is Raja Dhale's magazine. Satyakatha magazine is an established Marathi magazine, mainstream magazine.
K. Tanushri asks, thank you. The questions keep moving up. Thank you for the lovely presentation and the hard work that went behind the entire project. Did you come across any anonymously published magazines or works within the anonymously published works within these magazines? And second question, did any of these magazines cater to children?
No, I didn't find any anonymously published magazines, and none of them catering to children. Definitely not.
And none of the writers within these magazines also wrote anonymously, or did they use pseudonyms? Was there a, you know?
Pseudonyms. I didn't come across any, but I'm sure they were like using pseudonyms.
Udit Mavin Kurve has a question. Do we know the impact or influence of the Little Magazine movement and or Dalit Panther literature on Arun Kolatkar's work? And was the advertising industry open to writers, poets, artists from these movements? And the third question is, where can we access these digitized archives?
Okay. Arun Kolatkar's work, I really don't know if it I don't know if the question is asking if Arun Kolatkar's work impacted the movement or the movement and
reverse. Whether the movement impacted Arun Kolatkar's work.
I don't know. That was not, yeah, I didn't research on that. And advertising, so no, I don't think they were working with like, I don't even think advertising like copy editor type, industry even existed in the way that it exists like this, or did it? I don't know, but I don't think that they cared about that. For them, mainstream meant publishers or like magazines or newspapers. Like that's what it meant, not commercial advertising.
Yeah, since this is like a literary history question, like I suppose, and even I'm not very superbly familiar with Arun Kolatkar's work, but the question comes down to like how left-leaning, quote unquote, like Arun Kolatkar was in the 70s and in the 60s and the 70s, because that would have meant that he was hanging out in the same spots and having cultural exchanges with the Panthers possibly. So it's a question of that. Like, I mean, that's the place where we can extrapolate from, I suppose. Yeah.
And where you can digitize as of now, they're just on Instagram. If there's anything specific you want, you can reach out to me. You can email me.
We have an anonymous question. Was there an extension of these movements in South India? I wonder if they're asking about the Panthers or the Little Magazines, but anything that, with either of these movements, was there an extension in South India?
Little Magazine movement was there all over the world.
mean, yeah, I suppose since they're talking about extension, perhaps they're talking about the Panthers, maybe. Because the Little Magazine, yeah, exactly, it existed. Yeah.
Tamil Nadu has their own Panthers, not connected to the original Panthers. There are regional Panthers all over the country, and they're not connected to the original Panthers, but they are in the sense of ideology and history. So yeah, yeah, in that sense, like you can say descendants. I don't know.
No. They're like Shrujana, I feel like they're very clear descendants, because like it was only in like after the foundation
Yeah,
of
in
the
Gujarat.
Dalit
Yeah,
Panthers, and like like it gradually moves
yeah, of course.
eastwards. Like it moves from coastal Maharashtra to inside Maharashtra, and like goes like
No,
deeper
it's
into
there in
the,
Gujarat. There in Gujarat. It's there in UP. It's there in Punjab. So
yeah. I mean,
the
no, I
movement
mean,
propped up like,
yeah, yeah.
huh?
Like I feel like the Tamil Dalit Panthers like was actually drawing very directly from the Dalit Panthers of Maharashtra, the Dhale and Co. So yeah, so
Huh.
they actually drew quite
Even
extensively.
within
Yeah,
even within Maharashtra, a lot of random panther groups propped up all on their own, and they
yeah,
still continue to. Like just 4 years ago, I attended the inauguration of a new panther
yeah,
organization, and they are all coming from the same place, of course.
yeah.
But yeah,
I guess like in this sense, it's also a very unique feature of how culture sort of spreads within Bahujan communities, because there is no like formal association is not a predicate for something happening in a different part, because like there are these like sporadic outbursts. Somebody sees like the like panthers in their pomp in Bombay, and then like like they are starting a small group in internal Odisha. Like that's a very possible thing, and that has happened time and time again, right?
yeah,
So I suppose, yeah, so in that sense it's and that is also how the Dalit Panthers themselves are getting formed, right? Like vis-a-vis the Black Panthers,
yeah,
because
like Black Panthers. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, so that's a constant feature, like like to get influenced and inspired and like create something of your own. That's a very uh that keeps happening within Bahujan communities. Yeah.
Thanks, Rahee, and thanks, Shrujana. There's a Irina says, thanks, Shrujana. Your talk has been like Anandache Dohi Anandeche Taram.
That's it,
I'm
Tarang.
uh, meaning happy something.
Meaning like dohas of joy and like tarang of joy.
We
Thank you.
have, yeah, we
Yeah.
have questions. Oh, more questions coming up from Tanya George asking, was the disregard for punctuations, particularly English ones, a common occurrence? You mentioned one instance where it was an explicit choice, but were there more?
They were, yeah, every time that they chose to not use English punctuations was a very explicit choice that they made. They chose, that was a sort of a stance that they had taken. But in many little magazines you'll find English punctuations as well. So the thing is that no one within the little magazine movement anywhere in the world is working in full coordination with another person, right? It's not a formal thing at all. So it really depends on what that particular publisher in that particular moment feels, is friends with, is believing. It is very fluid like that. So yeah, if you do not see English punctuation being used, it's an explicit choice. And sometimes, yeah, it is common to find just dandas or dandas or semicolon. No, not
Yeah.
semicolon, colon. Colon is the two dots, right? Sorry. Yeah. Colons and dandas.
And yeah, like you're saying, so possibly a way to sort of mark some of these would be to see which ones are the ones that, I mean, would you say that, like, I mean, there's an ideological sort of difference between the ones that use the colons and the dandas and the ones that don't, or you're saying that it basically sort of just depended, it changed from time to time. It's not as if there was a burden of consistency that one had to stick with this.
There's no burden of consistency in this movement at all, in any sense.
Thanks, Shrujana. We have Mohit Shelare, who's saying great research, was thinking about the possibility after the research arrived at this point. Is there an afterlife for the project that can be shared with the larger public?
Yeah, there is an afterlife. There is very much an afterlife in the form of a website. We've been discussing it for a while, and yeah,
Yeah.
for now it's that much.
Right, right. Yeah, so there will be something, and that Shrujana
There
has
will
been sort of
definitely,
working towards. Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
definitely.
yeah. We have another question. So about passion being misinterpreted as anger and bitterness, have there been poets, writers, or artists who navigated this minimization in ways that altered this perception? And how to perhaps not trivialize this anger? Is it wrong to be bitter and angry, considering how much of trauma is caused by systemic oppression?
No, it's not. It's not. We are naturally angry. Sometimes we're tired of being angry. Uh, but yeah, I feel like uh, I don't think that it's being misinterpreted as anger and bitterness. I think it's written off due to the bitter and angerness and bitterness. The angerness and bitterness obviously exists, and it should exist because that's how we fuel our work. But that's not all our work is fueled by. It's fueled by much more than that. But yeah, how is it, and how to perhaps not trivialize this anger? I don't know how to answer that question because I'm not in the position of trivializing this anger. I am the angry one, so I can't answer this. Just don't.
Yeah. We have another question. Can you recommend contemporary anti-caste zines and self-published literature today?
Yeah, I think a lot of anti-caste artists publish zines. I know Priyanka does. Rahee writes a lot. Bakery, though, every single post feels like a zine in itself. Uh,
Plug your
I
own,
have
plug your
co-founded.
own publishing. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I was about to say I've co-founded a publication called Mavili Nadu Collective, where we are publishing and working on a lot of anti-caste expression. And there's Panther Paws. There's a lot of anti-caste self-published literature, and there has been a tradition of this in Maharashtra, in all the states. There's so much regional literature that is anti-caste, and nobody even considers that to be mainstream publishing. But those have been sort of the pillars of us being able to access half of the almost all of anti-caste literature.
Thanks, Shrujana. I think that's, we'll wait for a few minutes also to see if there are more questions coming in. I was sort of also wondering, I mean, in the process of your meeting so many of these writers, poets, publishers, and I think you've spoken about a great deal of generosity on their part, right? Like, to sort of open up all of these things and to sort of share it with you. In sort of the way that you plan to sort of take it forward, would they be sort of the people with whom you have those conversations, the discussions about the form in which it will be taken forward? I mean, how do you negotiate those things? How have you been? Yeah.
Whatever I mean, Satish sir is no more. I haven't seen Shinde sir in a while, but in terms of like everything that I have digitized ever, whether it is from JV Pawar's collection or not, I went one day and dumped everything into his son's computer, and I was like, just keep it. Like, I don't know, you may need it, you may need to show it somewhere. Your father may decide to publish something or come up with something, and he wants a certain image from a certain time. Like, I spent one whole day where I just sat there and transferred every single thing I ever digitized into JV Pawar's system. So yeah, and I don't know, I don't know if he remembers that it's there. It is possible that he's forgotten. I've given all of it to him, but yeah.
I don't think we have any further questions. Rahee, do you have anything more that you want to?
Yeah, I suppose to add to what Shrujana said, I mean, if Shrujana were to think the way most you see researchers in this country do, like, Shrujana should enter academia, like get like a fat thick like endowment to convert this into an archive and like pronounce herself an authority and like never share these works with anybody else, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. No, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's I mean, which is, because certainly, she may not be the first one to access these materials. One has sort of also seen other kinds of scholarship and so on that has emerged, but there is a culture of, let us say, keeping these things to oneself rather than sort of, collecting these things with the intent to sort of, put it out there and, like make it sort of, something that other people can also access to sort of, that people can learn from, grow from and so on. So I think it also speaks closely to what both of you were talking about, how then suddenly with access to sort of these sort of, this sort of Dalit Panther archive that Shrujana has been sort of building, all of these sort of, sort of these historical sort of like visual markers, motifs, but also literary, political positions, ideas, these are sort of the fact that this is now sort of then available to an entire sort of to entire generations, is sort of the driving force also behind sort of Shrujana sort of undertaking this project. So in that sense, it's far from a sort of all to sort of, in a sense, in order to help one sort of help one's own sort of personal sort of research and this and that. So absolutely, I think if we we do have I think 2 more questions that have come up. Okay, Udit Mavin Kurve says we should fund Shrujana to visit the Columbia Library. Yes, absolutely. And Shalini Mahadev asks, what kind of funding platforms support this kind of research? How can I work or join your kind of archiving work?
I think Sneha is the best person. I mean, Asia Art Archive, Sher-Gil Sundaram Foundation.
I mean, yeah, and how, I mean, yeah, I mean, there are, I mean, it's not an easy sort of, there aren't that many sort of funds or grants either. So, but hopefully there are more emerging, and even sort of what Shrujana has initiated, for instance, as with the kind of grants that Maveli Nadu sort of offers for, I mean, is sort of incredible, right? For poets and for, like, I mean, it's amazing for these kind of practices. So
Maveli Nadu has grants for poets, illustrators, zines, non-fiction writers, researchers. Rahee was one. Then for what else? There's a lot. There's like 6 categories. You can check out our website, and it's exclusive to SC/ST OBC communities.
Great. I think we are, we have one more. Okay, no, it's just a comment. It's from Nayantara, who says, such an insightful talk. Thank you so much for this. Look forward to seeing more from Rahee and Shrujana. So yeah, I think thank you so much, Shrujana, and thank you, Rahee, as well, for that really sort of incredible conversation that both of you had. I think you honed in on something very, very critical, which is this sort of how only sort of certain kinds of material, whether it's literature, whether it's periodicals, whether it's print material, etc., from marginalized communities go missing from the public libraries or archives. I mean, one is that they don't exist. The other is that they are this absence, that they go missing, this lost sort of thing, I think is, and there's something, I mean, this is also an experience, I think, that is shared by many sort of researchers across this region who work with sort of minor and marginal cultures and communities. And it is definitely not coincidental, but there is something definitely insidious and systemic about how this happens again and again. And I think you've also sort of really shed light on that. And I mean, a huge thank you to both of you. I'll just before we sort of conclude this, I mean, before we sort of just leave, I just want to invite Gayatri Uppal from the Sher-Gil Sundaram Arts Foundation to just share concluding remarks.
Thanks, Neha. Good evening, everyone. By way of introduction, I'm Gayatri Uppal, Associate Director, Grants at the Sher-Gil Sundaram Arts Foundation, or SSAF. On behalf of SSAF, I would like to thank Shridhar for this engaging presentation about her project, Architects of a Literary Revolution, Unpacking the Dalit Panther and Little Magazine Movement, for the 2019 SSAF AAA Research Grant for Histories of Ideas, Art Writing, and Visual Culture. And I would like to congratulate her on her research initiative to consolidate, digitize, and build an archive of the significant material. I would also like to thank Rahee Punyashloka for an insightful and engaging discussion with Shrujana. I thank the audience for joining us from different parts of the world and time zones and for their attention. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues at the Asia Art Archive, India, and at the Sher-Gil Sundaram Arts Foundation for their contribution to this event. At AAA, I would like to thank Sneha Raghavan, Senior Researcher and Projects Lead, Nupur Desai, Researcher, Samira Bose, Programs Coordinator, Pallavi Arora, Collections Assistant, and at SSAF, I would like to thank Latika Gupta, Director of Projects, Saurav Sil, Manages Visual Design, Media and Archives, Malavika Madgulkar, Assistant Editor, Publications and Communications, and Santosh Sane, our Accounts Executive. I'm happy to announce that we will be announcing the call for applications for the 2023 SSAF AAA Research Grant for Archiving Histories of Art, Ideas, and Visual Culture next week, and urge you to share the open call widely and encourage interested people to apply for the grant. The open call will be available on AAA's website, aaa.org.hk, and SSAF's website, ssaf.in. Please do visit our websites and follow us on social media for updates about our forthcoming programs and opportunities. Thank you all again for joining us today. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.